Thanks, Nash. I'm honored to be joined by our wonderful panelists and our moderator, who I will introduce in a few minutes. But I first wanted to set the stage with a quick background kind of on this series, why we've chosen in partnership with several groups to undertake this work, and some outcomes that we're hoping folks who participate in this series will take away, both from this virtual webinar and the second in the series, the in-person tour that is being led by the UC Merced Community and Labor Center across some communities in the Central Valley later in July. And so there'll be time to share a little bit more about the next event in this series. In the last 6 months, 13 atmospheric rivers hit California, bringing extreme rainfall, dangerous winds, record-setting snow to rural communities and farm-working communities across the state. Storms resulted in catastrophic flooding along the Central Coast in towns like Pajaro, across the Central Valley in communities like Planada, and in the Tulare Basin as Tulare Lake continues to reemerge with spring and into summer snowmelt. These same communities have experienced whiplash of disasters, from extreme heat to drought to wildfires to COVID and now flooding. We all depend on the labor and the resources from these communities for our food, and yet workers who live there and work there are consistently exposed to climate change fueled hazards, pandemics, unsafe working conditions, while many also lack access to public benefits and safety net programs that exclude non-citizens. Many of our panelists will be sharing about what those living in impacted communities experience and the work that they're doing to help them recover and build resilience. Some will share directly about how their relationship with the philanthropic sector impacts their ability to do work. Our partners in Philanthropy California have been working for a few months to put this series together in order to uplift urgent needs in these communities, as well as to highlight the amazing work that communities and organizations have been doing for decades. We hope that this series encourages all of you to move resources to communities recovering from climate change fueled storms across the state, particularly in the regions and communities that we're uplifting today and in July, and also continuing to move resources when emergent needs arise. We hope that this series helps build a deeper understanding of the importance of the Central Valley, particularly our second event, the tour, including many intersectional issues in need of support, from climate and disaster resilience to public health to workers' rights to immigration reform, food security and nutrition, democracy. It's a long list. We also know and recognize that many of these issues are not completely unique to the Central Valley, and as you'll hear today. So we hope that you take away universal lessons of some of the challenges folks are facing, and also some of the amazing, incredible work that communities are doing. We also hope that this series, this virtual and the in-person, won't be the end of our work and our focus on these communities. We hope to explore options for immediate action and long-term collaboration within the philanthropic community to really kind of come together to support communities that are in need. This session features speakers from organizations along the Central Coast and in the Central Valley to share about their work, including providing a foundational understanding of systemic inequalities that persist statewide, while foreshadowing some of the learnings those attending the in-person tour can expect to deepen. We hope that those attending this session will register to join us on the evening of July 12th in Fresno for a reception, and the 13th for the full day tour. Now I'm really happy to introduce our panelists. We're joined by Dr. Edward Flores, the Faculty Director of the UC Merced Community and Labor Center, Janaki Angaha, the Director of Advocacy at the Community Water Center, Daisy Salazar, the Program Manager of the Storm Assistance for Immigrants Program at Mixteco Indigena Community Organizing Project, or MyCOP, Paulina Moreno, Director of Special Projects at the Community Action Board of Santa Cruz County, Sebastian Sanchez, the Deputy Secretary for Agriculture and Immigrant Workforce at the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency, And finally, our wonderful moderator, Samantha Sandoval, the Grant Making and Special Projects Director at the Latino Community Foundation, who I will turn it over to now. And thank you all again so much for joining us today. And if you haven't, feel free to put some information about yourself in the chat so we can all know who's here. Thank you again. And Samantha, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Katie, for that wonderful introduction. And I hope everybody had a beautiful and bright summer solstice yesterday and took some time to reflect and rejuvenate yourselves for the upcoming summer. I hope it's filled with really great, incredible adventures. And I'm really excited to help lead this discussion around climate change, because as we know, climate change directly impacts all of us. And unfortunately, this fortunately impacts Latino and farm worker communities. We've seen that the direct impacts and with increasing intensity and frequency of wildfires, with sea level rise that Florida is experiencing now, with increased hurricanes, historic drought, extreme heat, which Texas is going through now, and also we most recently seen it with the floodings. At the same time, rural communities in California are suffering, going from historic drought to now flooding, while already facing incredible injustices that Katie mentioned, such as lack of work protections, extreme poverty, lack of affordable housing, disinvestment. And as also Katie mentioned, I'm really excited for our upcoming in-person Funders Tour, which I hope you all be part of. This is the second part of this two-part series. This will be an incredible opportunity to be in community with each other, to learn from each other, and also to meet incredible leaders working on the ground, while you'll also be having a direct firsthand experience and learning how you could accelerate and propel community-led solutions. Because as philanthropic leaders, it's really up to us to help take action, right? To ensure that we're propelling these solutions to help rectify these injustices, while also fortifying vulnerable communities. We have a duty to think long-term, to invest deeply in long-term solutions, because climate change is not going away. This is a long-term problem. And actually, that's what Latino Community Foundation, my organization has been doing. Since we launched in 2017, our California Wildfire Relief Fund, we've raised and invested over $4 million into grassroots Latino nonprofits across the state. These are organizations that are serving on the front lines of climate change. They're not only helping families during the aftermath of wildfires, but also ensuring that Latino immigrant voices are centered in community rebuilding and long-term recovery. We've also co-created the District Recovery Partnership in Napa and Sonoma counties in collaboration with 10 Latino Indigenous nonprofits. And this is an incredible disaster response and recovery model that is centering equity and justice while also building community resilience. At the same time, we are seed funding the California and DocuFund Network, which is an emerging coalition that's actually meeting these next 2 days to help further strengthen their bonds. It's a coalition of 25 immigrant rights and DocuFunds across the state. And they're building power in undocumented communities while also ensuring that disaster planning and response center those same voices. And so today, I'm really excited for all of us to hear from the brilliant leaders from Central Valley and Central Coast around the flooding impacts, while also learning about their efforts that are building community resilience on the ground. And then following this quasi-moderated panel, we'll hear from the government's perspective and their response to this issue. And then, of course, we'll have some time for questions and answers, so all your questions will be considered. And with that, I'd love to get us started. And so first off, we are going to be featuring Janaki with Community Water Center. And so I'll help kick it off with a question for you. So can you help us understand what led to this devastating flooding and what realities farm workers and rural communities face in the Central Valley?
Yeah, thank you, Samantha, and good morning, everyone. If it is morning for you, my name is Janaki Anaga. I'm the Director of Community Advocacy at Community Water Center, and I'm speaking to you from Sacramento, but I work across the state. Our offices are in Visalia, in Watsonville, and here in Sacramento, where we work on some of our policy issues. And to answer your question, Samantha, in the context of what we're discussing today, which is really the reality that we're awakening to related to the impacts of climate whiplash, right? Seeing these kind of extreme drought impacts and extreme flood impacts and some of the most epic climate impacts seen anywhere across the state, happening in the center of the state and in our farm worker communities on the Central Coast, is that many of these impacts, when we think about what these climate impacts are, it's a disproportionate experience of the change of the climate, right? And that happens through having vulnerable infrastructure, having insecure housing, and having inequitable access to the same emergency services that other people across the state have. And those things ultimately at their heart are rooted in some kind of racial inequity that's embedded in the history of the planning involved in the creation of California. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here, right? For these little communities that we at Community Water Center deal with, and you'll hear from these wonderful other panelists today who all work similarly with low-income communities of color across the state. For us, the community and Community Water Center are primarily what we call disadvantaged unincorporated communities. So these are little settlements or pockets of residential areas that are usually located in the periphery of a city or in the outskirts of a county. And over the course of the history of California, nobody has ever planned for these people. These are communities that have not arisen out of coincidence. They're the people who provided the backbone of the agricultural development of the state. They're people who moved into California or are communities that have historically lived in California and have provided, the workforce behind the blossoming agricultural economy that happened in the early part of the 1900s when California's agricultural economy was transitioning away from large-scale wheat farming to growing things like orchard crops and vegetables and all the citrus and grapes and peaches and things that were being demanded by the East Coast. And we were starting to produce them. And thanks to the creation of our irrigation infrastructure and our rail system, which was also created and developed by immigrants, those pieces of infrastructure then led to having scattered settlements across California that are still today the communities that are dealing with the worst impacts of environmental crisis. These are the communities that you read about in the Grapes of Wrath, and they're still there today. That are the wells that are now contaminated with pesticides and fertilizers, and folks who step out of their home and work 12, 14-hour days in the field, dealing with impacts of wildfire and local air pollution. So I wanted to just sort of set that up to say that when we're looking at solutions, we have to kind of think about these origins, right? And think, what is this current moment of maybe the fork in the road that we're at, to think about planning for these communities in a way that we haven't before, rather than sort of just reactionary support for these climate impacts. How do we totally reframe and rebuild these places with equity at the fundamental of the planning process? So with that being said, I wanted to just mention a little bit about how, when we're talking about flood, it's actually, like I said, because of the inequities embedded in who has access to safe infrastructure, it's the same communities that in the early part of this year were pulling up sand from their well because they don't have clean water due to drought. And over 1 million people in California still don't have access to clean drinking water. The very same communities are the ones that have been flooded severely during this recent major precipitation event. And, there are many definitions of drought. We have agricultural drought, we have, what we call an ecological drought. But in all truth, drought impacts, are still felt by the people who don't have access to the deep enough well to tap groundwater the way that the local farmers do. And that in and of itself is a structural inequity that's embedded in where our communities are placed across the state. So then kind of looking a few months later to when all of this rain happened, of course, the same communities that, are dealing with having safe housing and being able to turn on their tap to safe drinking water also dealt with the same impacts of flood and didn't have any local jurisdiction to kind of oversee the assurance that they be safe, be kept safe from those climate impacts. And because this is all such a combination of incredibly complex jurisdictions and incredibly complex oversight in the Valley, I wanted to share just one piece of mapping information, which, for all of you, I'm sure at this point in your time thinking about these things, you've undoubtedly seen maps like Cal EnviroScreen. Maybe you have seen, maps of valley disparity showing how the center of the state often, has some of these very low outcomes on the Human Development Index and continues to deal with some of the worst air quality and groundwater pollution. But what we sometimes don't know is, who actually provides services to these communities and who can be held accountable and who can be supported to actually improve access to emergency services in some of these areas. So I wanted to share this map, which is the California Special Districts Association. And for folks who are not aware of what a special district is, I'll just paint a little picture for you that as you're driving through the state of California from south to north, you're kind of just driving through little kingdoms of water, and they're not marked. You won't be able to see a sign that tells you you're moving from one to the next, but those are the jurisdictions whereby water is managed. And also keep this in the back of your mind, that's also how flood and stormwater is managed as well. So there are different districts that oversee the assurance of water being conveyed from our reservoirs into farm fields. There's districts that are tasked with ensuring humans get access to clean drinking water. These are usually called public utility districts or community service districts. And there's flood management districts that oversee the assurance that floodwaters are managed. And in California, we have 3,300 special districts. 3,300 special districts that oversee all these different services. So I just wanted to show you all the different kinds of districts that we have that are on the left here. So you'll see things like cemeteries, fires, flood and drainage, very importantly to you, irrigation districts, also important to you, open space, police protection, public utilities, which are very important to us at Community Water Center, as well as community service districts. And this is all to say, I'll just show you here really quickly that when we look at water districts, look at how many are in California. We have so many water districts. And I'm going to show you then how many flood and drainage districts do we have here? Very few, and where are we missing them? In the southern part of the valley, right? We don't have many flood management programs or districts located in the southern San Joaquin Valley where we need them most. So I show you this because where there's no city, there has to be some sort of district to ensure access to emergency services, protection from these various climate impacts, and safe and affordable drinking water being also one of those services. Where there's no district, nothing's happening in these places. There's just no oversight. So I wanted to share this information with you all as we go into this discussion today, and before I pass it over to some of these other panelists, and hopefully we have more discussion around this. And I wonder if I could just answer, the question in the chat here that says, many of these most impacted communities are in unincorporated areas. And that is exactly what I'm referring to here. And thank you, Alma, for saying that it is mainly in unincorporated areas where their most local form of government is going to be one of these special districts that I just showed you on that map. It's not a city council because they're not incorporated, right? And when you have a small pocket of human beings living out in the outskirts of the city, their only local government is going to be one of those districts. So where there is no district, nothing's happening to ensure that those people either get safe water, get pest protection, there's any form of law enforcement, that there's flood protection, all of those things that I just showed you in that map. So with that reality now being known, I guess I'll pass it back over to you, Samantha, to see if you'd like to pass it over to the next person or to any questions here.
Great. Thank you so much, Janaki. That was a really informative and powerful systems level overview for all of us. I definitely learned a lot, and that was a really useful tool as well. Thanks so much for sharing. So next I'm going to turn it over to Edward with UC Merced. And my question for you is, we really would love to hear more about the research that your team is doing on farm worker health, and also about the importance of community-informed research.
Thank you. I'm going to do a screen share because I have a few slides to share, if that's all right. So I'll start by saying that everything we do as a community and labor center is informed by the labor perspective. And so we conduct research and education on issues of community, labor, and the environment. Our mission is to build civic capacity and to serve the most disadvantaged residents in the San Joaquin Valley and beyond. Agricultural workers have a special place in the work that we do, because California agriculture was modeled upon the Southern plantation. And then in the 1930s, when modern worker protections were introduced, that the same worker protections that all American workers, major worker protections that American workers have today, these protections excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers, because legislators from the South didn't want Black workers to have the same rights as white workers, and Black workers were concentrated in agriculture and domestic work. Those exclusions still persist today. California might have a slightly higher standard than other states, but still on a national level, these exclusions exist. So we were the first major labor center to be established in California in the past 60 years as a sister institution to the UCLA and UC Berkeley labor centers. We're the largest center serving a rural region in the US. And our work has been very policy focused. We've informed the passage of several major state policies, such as SB 227, which would create a state-funded unemployment benefit system for undocumented workers. We'll mention that in a bit, as well as a $20 million line item for Planada and a $20 million line item for Pájaro as a result of the flood disasters. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So our areas are in four, we do work in four major areas: rural work, workplace health and safety, immigration and the safety net, and high road economic development. The research that we've done with immigrant rights and the safety net we had a report, Essential Fairness, that was published in 2022, last year, which was a major resource in the legislative analyses on AB 2847 to create an unemployment benefit system for undocumented workers, as well as worker relief, a fact sheet that we used to calculate the estimated contributions of employers on behalf of undocumented workers in California. And this informed the development of SB 227 this year. The Farm Worker Health Study was a $1.5 million project that was sponsored by the California Department of Public Health. And this was the largest ever academic study on the health and well-being of farm workers. We carried this out with a community advisory board that has close to 30 organizations. And they there were 10 organizations that conducted over 1,200 2 to 4 hour interviews in 6 languages. This was a major intervention in the field of public health because we asked questions not just about health and health access, but questions about work that hadn't been present in previous studies of farm worker health, such as compliance with workplace health and safety standards, like the heat standard. Very important if we're thinking about climate change and economic and climate resilience. We also asked questions about the prevalence of, we asked farm workers if they had access to unemployment benefits. And we released those findings at an in-person event with representatives from several state agencies and from the governor's office, several state elected officials. And so these are just, in a nutshell, some of the major findings. We found that 43% of workers in our sample said that their employer never even provided a heat illness prevention plan, which is mandated under state law. We're thinking about climate resilience, ensuring that these ensuring these types of worker protections are key, for workers that are working outdoor, as we begin to experience more extreme heat. 1 in 3 said that they would be unwilling to report employer noncompliance. And among those, nearly 2 in 3 said they would be unwilling to report due to fear of retaliation, such as job loss, having hours reduced, or being deported. 59% of farm workers said they were not eligible for unemployment benefits. So our report ends with policy recommendations to continue investing public resources in continue investing public resources in protecting workers' rights, to raise industry work standards, to improve access to economic and healthcare safety net, and to expand healthcare access as well. And I'll also mention the Blanada Community Needs Assessment Survey, which we conducted a couple of months ago in response to the flood disaster that happened on January 9th. On April 15th, state and local public officials and community leaders met to discuss what needed to be done in Blanada. And what the consensus that came out of that meeting, which we actually facilitated, was that there's a greater need for information on the extent of damage and devastation that was created as a result of the flood disaster on January 9th. And so out of that meeting in Blanada, we partnered with a community-based organization, Valley Onward, who we canvassed with for an entire weekend, knocked on every door in Blanada, about 1,000 homes, and collected over 200 surveys. So this was a major effort that really shows the power of universities and community-based organizations coming together to learn more about issues facing workers and how to support them. And on April 27th, we presented I should actually say, we had a presentation to the community on April 27th of the findings from the report. And we asked, we shared the findings, and the residents prioritized the items that they felt were most critical out of those estimates that we created in our report. And from there, a legislative ask was developed for $20 million in the community of Blanada. So I'll just share, very quickly the findings from the survey. Most Blanada households experienced at least one form of economic loss due to the flood. So this included either missing work and/or property being damaged. Out of 667 Blanada worker households in which work was missed due to the flood, 57% did not have a single worker in their household that was eligible for unemployment insurance. Of the 741 households that experienced property loss, either in or outside of the home, or loss of 1 or more days of work, 43% of those reported falling behind on bills. Most renting households did not have flood insurance at the time of the flood, and 1/4 of renting households experienced rent increase and/or threat of eviction, which we're told is against the law in a federally declared disaster area. More than half of Blanada households reported property lost inside or outside of their home. Out of the 461 households that experienced flooding, 74% lost property inside of their home. And out of the 461 households that lost property, 56% now have issues with mold in their house. 7% had issues with mold prior to the floods, but 49 out of that 56% said that they had new issues with mold as a result of the flood. So those were not prior existing issues with mold. A substantial number of households that lost property in the household did not receive a home inspection from a third party. So we estimate that 63% received a home inspection, but 37% did not. And among the 340 households that experienced property loss inside the home, the vast majority did not use large industrial dehumidifiers to dry out the home. 89% did not use large industrial dehumidifiers. We estimate that 164 Glenada households received inspections, and that the average estimated remediation cost was $34,518 per home. And then lastly, among 375 homes with property damage, 59% were eligible for at least one form of, sorry, that's a typo. So 59% were eligible for at least one form of disaster aid, but only 36% were qualified for at least one form of disaster aid. So among those 133, the average qualifying amount for aid was $11,628. To close gaps in federal disaster response policy, we listed out, we had estimates for the amounts that would need to be provided. So they're listed here on this in table 6.1. The community voted in favor of policy priorities. A letter was advanced. So the California budget actually now includes a $20 million line item for Glenada and a $20 million line item for Pajaro. This is as a reason, we were told that there wasn't a study like ours that had been done, but now with the findings from the study in Glenada, they were used to inform the legislative ask in Pajaro. And now we're developing a toolkit so that other universities in California can do the same type of research that we did should there be a disaster that happens in the near future. So those are all the slides that I wanted to present. But just, closing out, just wanted to say that the thing that we've learned the most is that in collaboration with unions, with labor organizations, with community-based organizations, that there's a lot of potential for addressing these major policy gaps that are affecting disadvantaged workers, particularly in rural areas, farm workers notably, and especially undocumented folks. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all that and for conducting this much needed research to help back up some of the policies that we know our communities face. It's really devastating to see some of those numbers, but I really appreciate your team and all the collaboration you've done so far. And so next, I'm really excited to hear from Paulina with Community Action Board of Santa Cruz. And so Paulina, I'm really excited to have you share more about CAB's role in supporting flooding impacted communities.
Thank you and good morning or good afternoon. As a former compañera mentioned, I don't know from where you are joining us this morning here. My name is Paulina Moreno. I'm one of the directors here at Community Action Board of Santa Cruz County. I'm gonna share my screen, and just because I'm getting some that my internet is unstable, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to turn off my camera while I share my screen, but hopefully you can hear me okay. So let me, I'm gonna try this, which is a little bit different than what I'm used to when I'm doing presentations. And really what I wanted to share with you this morning, are you all able to see my screen with the Yes, okay, perfect. What I'm going to try to do this morning is really just paint a picture of the impact of what took place in Pájaro and our response as CAB. And so I don't know how many of you have heard of Community Action Board, but we are part of a national network of community actions across the nation. There's pretty much a community action really everywhere in the United States. We all look a little bit different because we are supposed to be representatives of the communities that we serve. Sorry, let me see. Okay. Having a little bit of technical issues. Okay, very quickly, just to give you a quick background, at CAB, we serve to partner with the community to eliminate poverty and create social change through advocacy and essential services. We have various services and pillars around, our agency focuses on community services and crisis response. We do a lot of work around immigration and housing and employment. We have several programs that serve the entire community of Santa Cruz and extend oftentimes all the way to Monterey and San Benito County, specifically around our immigration services. We have attorneys on board, and we're an accredited organization that provides free legal support to low-income communities here in our area. Are you, oh my goodness, it says that, are you able to hear me? It says that I cannot.
Yes, we can hear you, Paulina.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I might need to go get a hotspot. As many of you know, and you probably have were exposed to articles and pictures in the news about, as Katie mentioned, the dozens of atmospheric rivers that hit our area beginning since late December. And these are just some of the pictures that demonstrate the impact in our area. That while we avoided flooding in January, our levees could not hold in early March. And so really this is just, I wanted to share some pictures that I'm sure some of you have already seen in terms of the devastation that took place in our area. But as you all know, on March 11th, there was a lot of water buildup as a result of the storms, which definitely breached our river, our levee, which caused extensive flooding in our community, damaged numerous homes and businesses, definitely causing unsafe sewer and drinking water conditions, setting local harvest seasons back and causing flooding at one of our middle schools, Pájaro Middle Schools, so much that students were actually having to attend classes over the bridge at a different middle school, one of our other middle schools in Watsonville. We know that there's approximately an estimation over more than 2,000 people were evacuated from Pájaro. We know that the residents were staying with friends, with relatives. Many of them, early on were having to stay in hotel rooms, having to pay out of pocket. We know many residents were also staying in their cars, and until emergency shelters were opened, that's when, some folks started going into emergency shelters. We know that, approximately more than 900 homes, businesses were damaged. Many were red tagged as unsafe to occupy. And of course, thousands of acres were already destroyed by the floods in January, made conditions even worse in March, when evacuation orders were announced in our county. We know that the communities that we serve, many had already missed weeks of work because they were living and continue to live with the uncertainty of not knowing when they're going to start earning a living again. The percentage of workers are work early on preparing and planting the fields, but due to the storms haven't worked at all since winter. And if you have ever eaten a strawberry, you more than likely is a strawberry that was harvested by the farm workers here in Pájaro and in Santa Cruz County. This is one of the pictures that I like to share because I don't know if you all heard in the news, you know, when the first floods hit, President Biden visited our area, but what President Biden unfortunately missed was coming to South County and seeing the work that was provided by oftentimes the people that are not seen or given attention to. These are some of the faces of migrant workers, of our day workers, of immigrant parents, of the unhoused community coming together to put together over 80,000 pounds of sandbags that were used then issue back to the community. This is a story that was not shared in the news, and this is a story that President Biden missed to see how the community came together early on in January to respond and to provide support to each other. This is some of our day workers that were also there and of our unhoused community that participates in some of our programs. One of the things that, you know, we initially did from the very beginning, because we're currently part of the Listos collective, and I know Sebastian is here and he'll probably share a little bit more, but, you know, we've been very fortunate enough to be part of a statewide efforts to provide and respond to crisis. Early on when the pandemic hit and the governor announced a couple of years ago the disaster relief assistance for immigrants, we were one of 12 agencies that was selected to distribute funding to undocumented workers. Very similarly, this time around, we were also invited to be part of the storm assistance for immigrants, and we are one of 17 agencies across the state that will be distributing economic relief to undocumented immigrant workers that live and reside in a county that was declared a state of emergency. And so I think that all of our work, you know, the result of our work means that we are trusted messengers in the community. Our staff reflect the communities that we serve. One of the many things that we've been very intentional, because we understand that diversity within the Latino community, within the indigenous community from Latin America, is that our responsibility is to hire people that speak the language. And so what I can tell you that we were at the scene on March 11th when evacuation orders were issued in our county. We were one of the few organizations that responded by sending promotoras that were indigenous language speakers to provide interpretation to families during that day. We were very disappointed to see that there weren't enough interpreters. There were not enough even bilingual staff. And so I want to stress the importance of building relationships with community organizations that are already know the community, have trust in the community, are known by the community to do this type of work. I will say that, you know, we had lots of challenges in how this work was, how we responded to this crisis, because, you know, unfortunately, you know, there are, what separates us from Pájaro is literally a bridge. And so, you know, there's a lot of political, unfortunate political discourse around whose responsibility it is to respond. And I will say that, you know, as organizations that had come together during the pandemic, we formed a triage, what we call ourselves the South County Triage, which is really a collective of nonprofit organizations that began to organize to respond to crisis. We're one of the leading organizations, along with Second Harvest Food Bank, Pájaro Valley Prevention and Student Assistance, and other organizations that collectively have been working to respond by creating subcommittees that are focused on creating communication that is not only in Spanish, but is also in indigenous languages. We are one of the only organizations in the county that operates a multilingual line that operates very similarly to a 211, but it's not there to replace 211. However, we do provide services in Spanish, Mixteco, Triqui, and English. And so we've been operating, we started that hotline when we were tasked with leading the census efforts in our agency, in collaboration with our county. And we figured, we needed to launch a hotline where people could call us. And from that, it's just morphed into different areas where we provide assistance. And so this is a picture of some of our promotoras where we quickly mobilized. One of our directors went to, I think Home Depot, purchased some vests, and we literally just printed things and them in the back that said, Mixteco or Triqui, so people could easily identify us and know what language our promotora spoke to get some assistance. This is another picture of one of the shelters. Santa Cruz County has operated one of the shelters in one of the fairgrounds, in our fairgrounds. And we were there from the very beginning, helping to organize. And when I say helping to organize, it was really an effort to create a schedule from the ground up, create a schedule where there was, we were receiving tons of donations and organizing the donations, creating an intake form so we could ensure that families were receiving the just the resources that they needed, whether it was, clothes, whether it was, food, baby food, or things for their children, creating a meal schedule, making sure that, we were providing updates to the community, because that was the biggest feedback from the community, is that unfortunately the county was not providing enough communication about what was happening. The county lifted the orders in March to approximately 2 weeks after, I want to say, allowing people to go back into Pájaro and assess, but there was no communication about the dangers of going back. We knew from the very beginning that there was going to be, contamination because of the flood waters, which carried not only contaminants, but sewage. And so we wanted to make sure, again, that we created and went door to door, talked to people about the risk of staying, right? Because that was never the intent. The intent was for people to go and assess the damage and then go back to the shelter. But people were so afraid of not being able to go back and stay in their homes, that many decided to stay, but in really unsafe conditions because of mold, again, because there was still water, there was still a lot of debris. And so we were, along with other CBOs, were going door to door, knocking and making sure that they understood the risk, and that information was, again, not only provided in English and Spanish, but in indigenous languages. Again, these are just pictures of what the shelters looked like, the donations. There was, Community Bridges did set up a laundry service for people to be able to wash their clothes. But it was definitely a challenge in terms of organizing and ensuring that people were receiving appropriate information in a dignified way, in a way that they, just given proper next steps. I think one of our biggest lessons, which, we did reach out to Cal OES, because we know Cal OES did respond, and they did send interpreters, and I want to commend, the state for also responding to and responding to our community. One of our biggest lessons, however, is the importance of interpretation, not just as interpreters, but interpreters that are advocates, right? And I think that's the biggest difference between us as CBOs who serve as interpreters, because our job is not simply to interpret bad news, but also to advocate for the family, right? We had the Red Cross come in and begin to let people know that, they could receive funding but there was a miscommunication. If they opted to receive that type of funding, they had to exit the shelter. And again, it was like, well, we cannot allow people to exit the shelter if they don't have a place to go to. And so again, our job is to advocate on behalf of the family, to ensure that families understood, but also to ensure that, you know, we were changing the guidelines so that people didn't have to leave the shelter, because we know that housing is an issue in our county, and there isn't anywhere where people can go. At one point, this shelter had over 400 people. Slowly, people have been trickling out. The shelter officially closed, I believe it was April, about mid-April. I can't remember the exact date. We have people still living in hotels that have not been able to go back to their homes. One of the things that I wanted to share before I close out and I transition, you know, I turn it over to Miko, is that we're currently every 2 years, as part of our community action responsibility, is that every 2 years we're tasked with doing a survey in the community to understand the impacts of poverty and how is poverty impacting our community. And that survey is not only important for us to understand, but it also guides our work. Honestly, that is how the Immigration Project was born. We're one of the few community actions that has an immigration project. That is how our Watsonville Works was born, to serve the unhoused community and provide them with jobs. And so many of our programs, that's how our youth center was born, you know, because we can use that data to then ask for funding. And, you know, by no means we're not we're not researchers, but we do, you know, engage in this process in collaboration. We do get some assistance from UCSC, Blum Center. And I get to lead this process of this community assessment. And we just finished gathering data of over 400 people that participated. And some of the top needs, and these are people in our community that are low income. We had, the majority of them are Spanish speakers. We had about 50 of them that were Indigenous language speakers. We held focus groups, again, 2 Indigenous, 2 Mixteco focus groups, and the rest in Spanish. But these were some of the things that to us came to the very top. The top needs in our community continue to be around employment, income insecurity. As you can see, respondents to our survey are telling us that 20% of those that participated are living on a wage that is less than $5,000 a year. $5,000 a year. So as we continue to think about what do solutions look like, you know, these are the realities that the communities that we serve are experiencing. Food insecurity, it was another top need. Lack of information about available community programs and services. Housing insecurity. And what our survey revealed was that there was a higher rate of challenges in all of these needs for Indigenous and Spanish language speakers, particularly farm workers, particularly those living in South County. And so for us, you know, before I go on, I wanted to just briefly share 2 quotes from the survey. They were in Spanish, but we translated them to English. But I'm going to read from 2 quotes that I think are important to, and that shed light to all of this work and the experiences that these crises are putting, and the burdens that are putting in our communities. And so one participant said, "In our lives, many things changed. Rent, food, children's childcare, everything is more costly. Many of those who contracted COVID did not wind up well. They say they're always tired and coughing. With the fires, many sections of the agriculture were contaminated, and we were breathing pure smoke. And now we are left frustrated with the flooding because work was delayed. The ranch where we work flooded, and to pay rent each month, we have to acquire the sum in full." that's one participant that unfortunately not only was our community experiencing the pandemic, we also went through fires. We are now, you know, through the floods. Another participant shared chronic stress because of the constant battle navigating the system when living under the shadow of the United States as an undocumented person. There's injustice, discrimination, lack of support that make up the system. There's a lot of racism and inequality inside the organizations that serve us closely because they are made of white people and they don't understand the experiences of people who serve them. These are, to me, when I read this quote, you know, it just, as we continue to think about what does advocacy look like, what can we learn from this, and what are some recommendations as we continue to explore what are some, you know, urgent government interventions and investments in our communities. And you know, I think I want to thank the University of Merced for launching that survey as we continue to explore and know that, you know, undocumented and Latino and Indigenous migrants are systematically left out of the disaster planning in California. And those who live in under-resourced communities have little recourse. And Pájaro is a clear example of those dynamics. I think that is all you know, these are just pictures that, you know, we're trying to do every Impact Wednesday, and we're trying to highlight the work of our interpreters and promotoras that are serving our community. But I'll stop there, and then, yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, Paulina, for everything that you and CAB has done to support impacted families on the ground. Those are really powerful quotes, really powerful images, really hitting home, right, to that experience and the realities that those communities face. I really appreciate too you elevating the gaps that exist, as well as highlighting the strengths of your organization that enabled you to mobilize quickly, right, to meet the diversity of that community that you serve. So thank you, Paulina. Next up, I'm excited to have Daisy kind of share more with us about what MyCop has done directly on the ground to support impacted Indigenous families, as well as a little bit more about the Storm Assistance for Immigrants program.
Thank you, Samantha. Hello, good morning, good afternoon almost. My name is Daisy Salazar. I am here representing Mixteco Indigena Community Organizing Project. I am the program manager for the Storm Assistance for Immigrants program. Currently, our program is running in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo County. Before I continue, I would like to apologize for possibly not having all the answers to the questions you might have. This program has been moving so fast. It was launched on the 8th of this month, and we have been having so many calls, so many appointments. But now I want to talk about a little bit about the SIDE program. The Storm Assistance for Immigrants program was developed in response to a series of storms across California in December 2022 through April 2023. The CDSS is providing state-funded storm recovery services to provide disaster recovery, case management, and direct assistance to eligible individuals who experienced hardship from these storms and cannot access federal assistance due to their immigration status. Like I said before, this program was launched on Thursday, June 8, and it is expected to run for a whole year or until the funds run out. Next, I would like to talk about the communities we serve as an organization and some of the barriers they face coming to this country, specifically coming into these agricultural regions. I also want to apologize. I don't have any pictures or slides, but I will share the link to our website where we do have like a lot of pictures and more information about our organization. California is home to an estimated 170,000 Indigenous migrants from the Mexican states of Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Michoacan, including Mixtecs, Zapotecs, and Purépechas. These indigenous populations face unique challenges, including language barriers, as they often only speak their native pre-Hispanic indigenous languages. They also have deep-rooted and unique cultural practices and beliefs that often create barriers and that isolate them from the other Latino populations. Most of them work in the row crop agricultural sector. Indigenous migrants earn meager seasonal wages with few, if any, employee benefits. As a result, they are amongst the poorest workers in the region. Language barriers prevent them from easily accessing available basic health and social support services. As the indigenous languages spoken are tonal and are over 3,000 years old. In addition, their immigration status often places them at risk for labor abuses and exploitation and retaliation for speaking out. Most of these workers often opt for not reporting employer abuses in order to protect themselves and their families from deportation or other retaliations. As a nonprofit organization, we help out the community in the best way possible through many programs and alliances. Our organization has programs in which our caseworkers translate, explain paperwork, and help submit applications to their best of their abilities and in the knowledge spoken by the community. As we have seen in the past years, we have faced many hardships as a society, and our indigenous farm workers have been at the forefront as essential workers. They have worked through the hottest summers and not too long ago through a pandemic and recently through these storms. As a previous COVID-19 rapid response promotora here as well with the organization MyCop, I saw how our community struggled through the pandemic. Like many, they lost family members, were isolated or distanced from each other. Some were sick for a very long time, and aside from already struggling financially, they lost even more wages by not being able to return to work sometimes. Some were not paid for the 2 weeks that most of people that were working were entitled to, like 2 paid weeks if they did get COVID. And when it came to our program, there was only so much we could do. We handed out home test kits, and we also did testing here at the office. However, the testing kits that they took home the instructions were in English and in Spanish. And something these communities struggle with sometimes is that they don't read or write, and Mixteco or any other native language sometimes isn't written out. Let's see. When it comes to the recent storms, we have started off with this program. Today actually marks 2 weeks from the program launching. We have helped over 900 families in the Santa Barbara and Ventura County combined. We have appointments booked for the following 3 weeks out. And as I mentioned before, we currently only have this program going on to help out the communities that were affected by the storms. We hope, of course, that as time moves along, we can continue to have this kind of program to continue to help out the community. And then lastly, I just want to talk about some of the challenges we face. One of the most common barriers we face, I think, with any program is the language barrier. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are many variants. For example, when it comes to Mixteco, there are many variants depending on the region they are from. But there's also Triqui and Purepecha, which some of our coworkers also speak. Another barrier we face is space and material. Our organization has been growing a lot within the last couple of years, and we have had new programs in the organization, and with the programs come bigger teams. And recently we've had an issue of sharing office spaces with other programs. Of course, with having bigger space, we would be able to serve the community. And one other thing that we see our community struggling with is public transportation. The public transportation here isn't the best. So when we book appointments, they don't always have like transportation to get here, or we have to try and see what works best for them. And that is kind of all we have for right now. We do see that a lot of the community members were affected. They weren't able to work at all because the fields were completely flooded. Some weren't able to pay rent because, again, they didn't have work. And yeah, we just hope that we continue to get support from other organizations and other community members to continue to help out the Indigenous mixed community.
Thank you so much, Daisy, for all your work and for elevating the diversity that exists in Latino Indigenous communities here in the state, and also for elevating the demand that you're receiving from the community for the need for these financial resources and the important role that community-based nonprofits play as a conduit for these financial resources from the government. And so before I turn it over for questions and answers, I also am excited to have our last speaker share a little bit more about the government's response and their perspective to this issue. And so Sebastian, so I'm excited you're here.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning or afternoon to everyone. My name is Sebastian Sanchez. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Immigrant and Agricultural Workforce here at the state's labor agency, where we oversee 7 boards, panels, and departments, including the Employment Development Department and the Department of Industrial Relations, which contains the Labor Commissioner's Office in Cal OSHA, as well as the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, amongst the few. So I wanted to share really quickly, and I want to thank all the speakers for sharing the impact. I think it's really critical to get this insight from local community partners, folks that are on the ground, that respond quickly and are present to support the communities that are impacted by these disasters. And there's a lot for us to learn. And I think in our practice generally as the state, we have really been working on developing relationships with organizations such as the ones here today, and working to collect information through them, to connect to community members through them, and really we do rely on their support and their ability to gather information. So I just want to thank them for all they shared. I wanted to share quickly today just a bit of information on how the state responded to the storms, both in the short term and immediate, as well as what we're thinking about longer term response, and also just really thinking about how we can work effectively with philanthropy in terms of addressing some of the needs. So I think once the storms started in December and January, there were some immediate things that the state does. There are disaster recovery centers that we work with FEMA on, local assistance centers where the federal government hasn't declared a disaster. We set up one-stop shops where we try to provide critical government services. We try to bring as many state agencies and departments to that space, so that it's just this one-stop location where workers can go to either replace lost or vital documents, to connect them to necessary services, to provide them information. I think those are just two critical things that are automatically set up, but I think we also recognize that those spaces may not necessarily be accessible to all community members. I think we recognize that there's an ongoing challenge and an ongoing challenge for us to improve our ability to provide effective language access. I really just want to highlight what Paulina and what our colleague from MyCop shared. Indigenous language communities are particularly affected, and these organizations like CAB and MICOP and CBDIO as well are able to move much more quickly to provide that support to those communities. So I think it's something that we recognize it's a space where we have a lot of work to do. Although Cal OES has developed a contract where we can get interpreters, and it's something that we're working with communities to identify where do we need interpreters to be present. I think one of the other things that we really try to do immediately is really mobilize existing outreach strategies. So in the Central Coast, we were still organizing our COVID-19 workplace outreach project was still working, and we were using one of their outreach events to provide storm response as well. So we were connecting that event to Cal OES, connecting them to FEMA to ensure that the resources that workers were needing in the moment were being provided, and really using that existing network and existing capacity that we had in the moment to be able to drive resources to the community. We also do a lot of work in terms of gathering information. We set up various task forces throughout the state. Cal OES helps coordinate bringing together agents, all of the state's agencies. Really, we had daily meetings every morning at 8 o'clock to go over, okay, who have we been speaking with? What are the unmet needs? Where do we need to be present? And a lot of that time, it really relied on us reaching out to community stakeholders, to community partners, to really identify where those gaps were. So I know I was in calls with the UC Merced CLC team, asking them to connect me to, the community advisory board that they were using for their farm worker health study survey, reaching out to our various networks to really get that insight as to where do we need to be present. And I think that agencies across the state were doing that work of really leveraging their relationships with community partners to try to identify at the most local level where we needed to mobilize services and support. We also continue to set up informal and formal listening sessions as we continue just to really hear from community members directly what those needs are. And I think that we were trying to translate, we've tried to translate that into action, mobilizing different parts of the state apparatus to address the impacts of the storm and trying as much as possible to get resources where they were required. I think a few of the things that I want to highlight in terms of thinking about benefits that are made available and trying to set up infrastructure to distribute additional benefits. When disasters hit, there are things like DSS's disaster Cal Fresh food benefits that can be triggered, and we work closely with counties to submit applications to USDA to make sure that those additional food benefits are available to families that are impacted. Disaster and employment assistance is triggered, so EDD has to work to kind of set up that infrastructure to distribute that money. We also work closely at EDD. Our department submits applications for the National Dislocated Worker Grant. This is emergency funding made available from the Department of Labor, where we've applied for over $20 million to provide cleanup and repair services, which is really targeting at supporting workers that have been dislocated to do that work of cleanup and repair. And we're working on modifying that application to include the impact of the March storms. It's a little delayed, but that money is going out to various workforce boards in the impacted areas. So I think on the immediate kind of short-term response, that's where the state is really thinking through what are available funds, where can we get information, where do we need to send resources and support. I think the longer term and really thinking about how do we prepare, I think Janikai mentioned that, and I think Ed also mentioned, these are not, the devastating impact on these communities is not in an isolated space. This is based on historic exclusions. It's based on inequities that have existed for a long time. And I think as the state, we've been trying to think about how can we start to address some of this impact, and what can we do to really ensure that funding sources that are in the existing budget, funding sources that are ready to be deployed, are addressing these needs. So an example of this is really thinking about the Community Resilience Center funding that it will be going out. It's about $270 million that will be available over the next few years. And these are funds that should be used to construct and upgrade neighborhood level resilience centers, to provide shelter, comprehensive emergency response, and resources during climate emergencies. Earlier this year, we connected them with farm worker resource centers that another part of the state is connected with, to really think about where are these rural spaces, where are these spaces where farm worker families are present. We need to make sure that this funding is going into those spaces, to those unincorporated areas and counties where there may not be resources. And I think that that's something we're really focused on, is ensuring that communities that typically don't have access to these funds, and don't have access to resilience centers, are able to access this incoming money. Another thing that we're working on doing is the secretary of my secretary for the labor agency. There's a pot of money from the federal dollars that are discretionary, and we're using that to think about how we can mitigate the impact of climate change for farm workers, whether it's through training, whether it's through support services, really kind of pivoting the use of that money to redirect it towards, there's the reality that farm workers and rural communities are being disproportionately impacted by climate change in California. So I think that is the mindset that this government is in, of redirecting and really rethinking about how we can use existing money to address this issue. There's also, I think, a broader effort to think about how we can better support local governments in working with organizations like the ones that presented today. I think that's something that, as a state, we have the Office of Strategic Communications and Community Partnerships that is focused on that at the state level, of how can we better engage community groups, really building on our experiences with the census and our various COVID outreach strategies. But we want to make sure that local governments that often hold the keys to addressing some of the immediate needs that communities have, we really want to think about how they can better support workers. So GoBiz, for example, just recently released a request for proposals for a local immigrant integration and inclusion grant. And this is just under $10 million, where we're hoping to support the development of immigrant integration efforts, really increase that community trust, and enhance the capacity of local government to engage with community-based organizations. There's an information session, just throwing this out there. There's an information session tomorrow for CBOs at 11 a.m. Happy to share the information on that in the chat. But the idea here is that we want to support local government to do economic development work, social services navigation, technical assistance, civic engagement, and to work closely, especially where local governments may not have that experience of connecting with local communities, to connect with CBOs and join them as a sub-grantee to join as applicants together for these funds. So again, this is kind of the longer term thought process for the state as we look at how we can better support immigrant and rural communities impacted by the storms. It's really thinking about driving funds that are targeting the specific needs of these communities. I think we have, when we think about working with philanthropy, I think if I want to leave one thing clear, is that we want to work in partnership. We want to work in partnership with community-based organizations. We want to work in partnership with philanthropy. There's opportunities here where, whether it's providing technical assistance to organizations to apply for these funds, I think that's a critical part of the work. One of the things we're focused on at Labor Agency is really building the universe and the ecosystem of organizations that are applying for workforce development dollars. Something that we're working with, trying to work with the UC Merced CLC team on, really identifying organizations that have been doing workplace rights work but may not have as much knowledge of workforce development. We really want to grow the universe of these organizations and grow their capacity to apply for funding. It's critical to establish those connections to broader recovery efforts and other support services, where there are just I won't say limited, but there are a typical group of organizations that do receive that funding. So we really hope that philanthropy can work with us to build the capacity of other organizations. I think another opportunity is really thinking about how we can invest in innovative communications. We've heard over and over today about the difficulty in getting information out to community members. While we are trying to do our best in the state, we're working with community partners. I think there's an opportunity here to think about creative ways in which we can deliver information to community members. We want to think about creating immigrant-friendly resource hubs. This is a space where philanthropy can really play a role of helping build spaces where immigrant families can easily access information, where there's language access, where it's culturally sensitive information. I think one of the things I remember hearing the most when I talked to an organization, to CBDIO, about what the needs of the community was, I was told, a lot of the food that is being served isn't culturally appropriate at these centers. There should be an effort to really make sure that the food that is made available to families is something that gives them comfort. So I think that there is a space for philanthropy to kind of step in and provide that support. And I think one that is fairly obvious, and I think has been pointed out, right? A lot of the federal benefits that are available are not available to undocumented workers, right? Whether it's unemployment benefits, disaster unemployment benefits. I think there's a critical need here to ensure that funds are going to those communities. The storm assistance for immigrants program is a clear way that the state is looking to respond to that gap. It's intentionally designed to be eligible only for workers or individuals, who are not eligible for other forms of assistance. But we can always use more funds and resources to help those communities. So I'll pause there because I know we're running short on time, but really just want to encourage and folks to reach out to us if you want to partner with us. We're open to doing that work.
Thank you so much for those perspectives and those ideas of where philanthropy could fill in some of the gaps. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm just going to open it up to Q&A to see if there's some burning questions out there. Feel free to unmute yourself. If none, then I want to ask actually a question of Paulina. If you could actually kind of tell us more about your relationship with your local community foundation and how that played a role in your response efforts.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for that question, Samantha. Because prior to any state response or just the community foundation, or Santa Cruz Community Foundation, and most recently with the storms, the Monterey County Community Foundation were instrumental in responding to just collecting donations and making it possible for us to immediately respond to a crisis. During COVID, our Santa Cruz Community Foundation was really just a partner in an effort to provide economic relief even before the disaster assistance was announced by Governor Newsom. The Community Foundation had been talking to funders, collecting donations, and really handing them over to CBOs like us in order to, trusting CBOs and working with us to respond immediately without any strings attached to community members. And I think that was a huge impact, because it meant that, we were able to provide, people were able to stay housed during COVID. We were issuing what we dubbed no barrier, low barrier rental assistance. And so specifically targeting the immigrant community, people would call and, it was a quick assessment of how much money do you need to stay housed, and checks were being issued so that people wouldn't be evicted from their homes, and to prevent people from, just becoming homeless. And over that period, there were more than $900,000 distributed as a result of our community foundation again, working with us to provide emergency relief and really their role in stepping in to responding to the crisis. And again, most recently with the storms, it's been a collaboration between Monterey and Santa Cruz Community Foundation to provide nonprofits like us an opportunity to issue a quick economic relief in $500 increments at the moment. And in the immediate, it was a first wave of 500 economic relief to people impacted by the floods. Now there's a second wave. And again, this is even before the state issued any type of economic relief. There's a second wave that allows people to receive additional money. And there's going to be a third wave. And so this has all been the result of philanthropy, our foundations coming together and talking to funders about the importance of creating systems that don't, create barriers to reach in emergencies, those that are most impacted, and that they are not giving us any limitations, right? Like we can help anyone regardless of their immigration status.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And we are 2 minutes before the end of our time today. Thank you all again so much for joining us. Viri, I see your question, and I'm sure it's one that we will continue thinking about and diving into next month when we visit communities in the Central Valley. And also feel free to follow up with me, and I can connect you with speakers if folks have additional questions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and to Samantha for moderating. This was a really wonderful introduction to this series, providing some foundational understanding for us. Hopefully, as folks registered for this will also join us for the tour next month. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a good rest of your week.